At a Hanukkah celebration at the White House in December 2019, former and now current President Donald Trump signed an executive order that made Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act apply to anti-Semitic acts. Title VI prohibits discrimination on the grounds of race, color, and national origin, and since 2019, anti-Semitism. Remember, Hanukkah 2019. The White House was spurred by a rise in anti-Semitism incidents since 2013 and was looking for a way to ensure colleges take anti-Semitic acts seriously. Boy, oh boy, that presidential order really quelled anti-Semitism on college campuses. Just kidding. But what it did do was allow groups such as the Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law and Students Against Anti-Semitism to file federal lawsuits against schools that enable anti-Semitism, thus violating Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Fast forward to mid-January 2025. The Department of Education, under the Biden administration, resolved a small number of its many remaining Title VI cases involving allegations of anti-Semitism. Washington University, Emory, and Lehigh University, among others. Kenneth Marcus, founder of the Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law, accused the Department of Education of being in a rush to issue weak resolution agreements. Michigan Representative Tim Walberg has called the recent resolutions toothless and disgraceful. Emory University's agreement is unique. I need to share this with you. The entire complaint related to allegations of anti-Palestinian discrimination following a crackdown on an unruly campus protest where 28 pro-Palestinian protesters were arrested. Emory agreed to review its policies, get this, for the equitable handling of protests. In this case, a protest that in and of itself violated Title VI. The Trump administration and its Department of Education, which, by the way, he threatens to close, inherits the remaining cases from such elite universities as Columbia, Cornell, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. But wait, there's more. One day after Trump took office, January 21st of this year, Harvard settled 2 Title VI lawsuits accusing the university of mishandling anti-Semitism on campus. Okay, are you still with me? I have a special guest with me on today's American Jewish Medical Association podcast, The Voice of Health. The Sabbath is a day of rest for the Jewish people, but Shabbos Kestenbaum works around the clock the other 6 days of the week as one of the greatest young Jewish pro-Israel advocates fighting anti-Semitism wherever he sees it, primarily on college campuses, especially the one where he recently graduated, that school in Boston. Welcome, Shabbos.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, I had a big intro, Shabbos. The floor, or let me say the microphone, is now yours. Please give us your opening comments.
Sure. Well, I think number one, you did a really good job in terms of the historical context. So Executive Order 13899, which was the executive order that President Trump signed, really is the crux of our lawsuit. We have made a reasonable argument, and the court allowed us to go to trial, so clearly our judge, Judge Richard Stern, seems to agree that Harvard has reneged both on its school code of conduct and its contract that we have signed when we give them tuition, and they, in response, give us a credible educational experience. But more importantly, they have clearly violated the civil rights of Jewish students on college campus, in particular, the plaintiffs in those cases. To me, I would not be able to settle anything whereby Harvard refuses to admit any wrongdoing, where they refuse to hold their professors or their students accountable, whether that means discipline and punishment, that refuses to do anything about the curriculum themselves, that are incubators for hate and political indoctrination and anti-Semitism. So as Ken Marcus, who was my lawyer, who I have tremendous respect for, in the Brandeis Center, he called this the Trump effect, and I believe that's pretty accurate. These universities are scared of the looming threats to their funding, looming threats to their endowments as it pertains to taxation. And I do know that that is why Harvard wanted to settle at this particular juncture in time. At the same time, as I mentioned, I cannot settle at this time if it means that there will not be the structural reforms that I know are incredibly important. The other point I wanted to mention was I am delighted that there are dozens of similar lawsuits filed by heroic Jewish students across the country. It's not just a Harvard thing, it's not just an Ivy League thing, but institutions of higher learning that have clearly betrayed the trust of the American taxpayer, that have clearly discriminated against Jewish students, they will be held accountable in a court of law. And I think that's how we are going to create change. It is not going to be working within the system. It's not going to be working within DEI, for example. It's going to be young American Jews who hold them accountable in a court of law and in the court of public opinion.
Okay, let me just emphasize, I know you're not a lawyer, Shabbos, but would there be any legal recourse for victims of anti-Semitism on college campuses if not for this change by Trump in 2019?
So yes and no, because Title VI, even without that executive order, would still have discriminated anti-Semitism. Would still have included discrimination of anti-Semitism.
Right.
However, this executive order strengthens Title VI. So it basically mandates the federal government to incorporate the IRA definition when it comes to disciplinary proceedings. So we still would have had the case, but this certainly helps us.
Right. And let me be ignorant a little bit here. Why didn't the executive order change Title VI affect what happened on college campuses post October 7th? Didn't universities know about this change?
Well, that's that's a question I can't answer. I mean, we could say, why is it that you have three of allegedly the leading intellectual pioneers of our time, Claudine Gay of Harvard, Sally Kornblum of MIT, Liz McGill of Penn, why is it that they would not be able to clearly articulate that the calls for genocide against Jewish people would in fact violate their code of conduct? Why is it that institutions of higher learning that are allegedly elite, that they would allow their classrooms to be interrupted for calls of an intifada, that they would allow American flags to be burnt or replaced, that they would allow Jews to be disenfranchised from the classrooms or from libraries? These are all very, very good questions. I don't know why it is that certain college campuses, in particular the Ivy Leagues, have so acquiesced and placated to the woke radical mob. I can speculate, I have a few theories, but ultimately these institutions have so blatantly exposed themselves to be nothing more than intellectually bankrupt and morally corrupt.
Right. Now, you mentioned other lawsuits have been filed. Do you have any, can you quantitate that? Do you know the number of lawsuits filed? And again, I'm not a lawyer either, but why isn't there like a class action status? I'm sure many of these lawsuits are asking for similar changes.
Sure. So in terms of quantification, I don't have an exact number, but UCLA, Yale, Penn, Berkeley, I mean, you name a college and odds are they have a lawsuit. In fact, we started about a year ago a WhatsApp group, a very organic grassroots WhatsApp group of Jewish students who basically have one of three things in common. Either we've testified in front of Congress, or we appear on national media, or we filed lawsuits against our university, which, number one, is a very odd thing to have in common. That's a pretty damning indictment on the state of higher education,
Sure.
that such a WhatsApp group is necessary. But number two, we have, I believe, 80 members at this point. So there has really been a rising up moment for young American Jewry. So it's certainly in the dozens at this point. In terms of why is it that this is necessary, going back to your earlier question, again, I think DEI is to blame. I think the foreign funding is to blame. I think the fact that in the imagination of the American people, or perhaps more particular within academia, Jews have the misfortune of being mischaracterized as white. So whether it is 4 babies or 40,000 babies who were beheaded on October 7th, as my classmates will tell you, resistance is justified when people are occupied. In fact, Harvard, we were the first university in the world, because of Chabad, to showcase that 45-minute Hamas snuff video of the GoPro footage that they themselves filmed on October 7th. And we had, I would say, 400 or so people who showed up to the screening, but the majority were Jews, were people like me who really didn't need to see the video. Perhaps infamously, the president of the university at the time, Claudine Gay, did not show up.
Shocking.
So you can show people the most horrific, gruesome videos, but at the end of the day, it's not going to move people because they see it through the prism of oppressor and oppressed. And as I said, Jews have the misfortune of being mischaracterized as white, and therefore we have the misfortune of being mischaracterized as oppressors. Mm-hmm. And that has been a very difficult argument and narrative to overcome thus far.
Right. Back to the lawsuits, Shabbos, what are the specific changes that not only your suit, other suits against Harvard, other suits against many of the Ivy League schools. What specific changes are they asking the universities to comply with?
Sure. So at its crux, we are not asking for special treatment under the law. We are asking for equal treatment under the law. And as I said earlier, what a shame, what a damning indictment that we need a lawsuit for Harvard to do these things. And in fact, if you look at the settlement which was reached yesterday, which again, I'm glad many of the things I asked for are in the settlement. I'm glad that there will now be an official partnership with an Israeli university. Yes. I'm glad that the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism will be incorporated. I am glad that there will be a reformation of the Title VI office. I'm glad that those demands were met. At the same time, why didn't Harvard do all of those things anyway? Because that is obvious. That's a no-brainer. That yes, Zionism is a religious belief held by the overwhelming majority of Jews, and discriminating individuals based on their Zionism is discrimination. Why do we need a lawsuit for that? But I digress. In terms of the specific reforms we're asking for an independent third monitor to make sure Harvard's in compliance with their Title VI obligations. We want there to be full transparency and even the rescinding of the hundreds of millions of dollars Harvard receives annually from anti-democratic, anti-Western, anti-Semitic countries like Russia, China, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. We are asking for full tuition reimbursements and monetary damages. We are asking that the curriculums that we have clearly identified, as I said, are incubators for political indoctrination, that are incubators for anti-Semitism, be overhauled. We are asking for the disciplinary actions against professors who took part in the encampments, who encouraged their students to violate Harvard's internal policies. We are asking for disciplinary consequences against students themselves, who not only violated Harvard's internal policies, but in many cases violated state law and federal law, like the two students who were just arraigned in Cambridge court for physically assaulting a Jewish student at Harvard Business School. And again, why is it that we need a lawsuit for Harvard to do any of these things? So we will continue to put maximum pressure in the court of law and in the court of public opinion.
So many of the demands you said in the settlement were met. There's still many outstanding ones, but is more that Shabbos bringing former President Claudine Gay and some of these other top administrators on TV in Washington, D.C., to hear them, and we did hear them when Ms. Stefanik interviewed them a year or so ago. Is that also a big part of it?
I'm salivating just thinking about it. Yes, honestly, let's be totally transparent. Yep. We in this country are suffering from what I always call a crisis of accountability. Whether it's the southern border, whether it's the subways of New York, whether it's our college campuses, lawbreakers are immune from prosecution and from accountability. And at its core, if we want to make sure that no Jewish student in the future, no student period in the future, will be treated the way that Harvard treated me, there needs to be consequences. There need to be punishment and accountability. And part of that is taking individuals like former President Claudine Gay, like current President Alan Garber, like the DEI officers, and asking them under oath on a deposition, why is it that you refuse to do anything to alleviate the concerns of Jewish students? That means going through discovery. And through documentations, through private correspondence, getting to the root of your question. Why is it that these institutions so abandoned its Jewish students? And I will not be satisfied until there is clear discipline, accountability, and yeah, it might sound vindictive, but punishment. That is the only way that you are going to end this cycle of discrimination and the cycle of lawlessness. Holding lawbreakers accountable. It's not enough to simply have a slap on the wrist and for them to commit themselves to doing the right thing anyway. There needs to be structural change, and structural change, I believe, is only brought about holding those in power accountable.
Great. And just for our audience, Shabbos, none of these people you mentioned were pardoned in the last few weeks, correct?
Correct.
All right. So Shabbos, you and I had the pleasure of a meeting in the Cherry Hill JCC when you spoke a few months ago. During the Q&A session, I asked you the following. If you were the parent of a bright, talented Jewish high school senior applying to college, would an application to Harvard, or let's broaden it, any Ivy League school be submitted? How did you answer?
I hope I answered the same way I'm about to answer now, because my thinking has evolved. So you'll tell me if I did a good job.
All right.
I'm always reluctant to tell people where they should or shouldn't go. What I will say, and I'll highlight this with an anecdote. I was invited to speak at the CUFI conference, the Christians United for Israel conference, which is the largest gathering of pro-Israel Americans in the United States. It's much larger than AIPAC. And I took the red eye from LA to DC, and I enter my hotel room. I'm hot, I'm exhausted, I don't smell particularly great, I just want a shower. And I enter my hotel room, it's past midnight, and there's a gift basket waiting for me on my bed. And the gift basket has a handwritten note for Pastor John Hagee saying, Mr. Kestenbaum, we stand with Jewish students on college campuses. We are praying for our hostages. We are with you. Am Yisrael Chai.
Wow.
And the gift basket was not just exclusively kosher food. It was exclusively kosher for Passover food. And this is in July. It's like those potato sticks and those macaroons. And I posted about this on social media, and it gained a little traction, where I said, for months and months, we Jewish students have been fighting for the bare minimum. If you're a professor and you cancel class because you encourage your students to protest for the Intifada, if you bring in your political indoctrination into the classroom, you should be disciplined. That is completely inappropriate. And we have to fight Harvard tooth and nail for those things. We have to sue them in a court of law to get those things. And it occurred to me, while we are fighting for the bare minimum, there are peoples, there are institutions, there are organizations, and yes, there are universities that don't just accept and tolerate Jews, but love Jews and welcome Jews and want Jews. And why is it that we would fight for breadcrumbs? Why is it that we would fight for a seat at a table when we as the Jewish people and we as the American people are so much better? We are better than institutions of higher learning that are unable to condemn the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. We are so much better than institutions that placate and acquiesce to the most radical, loudest voices on their campus who burn American flags. And Jews are innovative, we are creative, we are resourceful, we have outlasted the Byzantines and the Romans and the Persians. We have been around for 3,000 years, and guess what? We will be around for the next 3,000 years. We do not need Harvard. We just don't. We will continue to be innovative and creative and resourceful. On the contrary, Harvard really needs Jews. Right. They really need Jews. And if they want to insist to accept these radical, loud students that I mentioned, then fine, go for it. But we are so much better than you, and the American people are so much better than you. So while I will not tell people where they should or shouldn't go, what I will say is that go to institutions where your values will not just be accepted, but they will be amplified, they will be celebrated, and you can grow. And I just do not think, as of now, one can make a credible argument that you can do those things at Ivy Leagues.
Right. Answer very similar, and he used the phrase, Harvard needs Jews more than Jews need Harvard, which I think you summarized with those comments. Let's talk about our current administration threatens to cut federal funding, rescind federal endowments from schools that continue to foster a culture of anti-Semitism. I think that's called hitting them where it hurts. Is that viable? You think it's going to happen?
Yes. For sure it's going to happen, and it's good. It is a good thing. Just like I said, the reason we don't want to settle, the reason we want to go to trial is because there needs to be accountability. Right. Accountability in the forms of an endowment tax, accountability in terms of federal funds being withheld. I mean, that is a godsend, and that is the only way you're going to have universities change. Once their bottom line, once their money is being threatened, that will create the structural reforms we are looking for. I mean, Harvard is the best example of this. Harvard is not an institution of education. It's a business. It's a hedge fund. It's a $50 billion hedge fund. They spend significantly more resources on their lobbying firms, on their hedge fund, on the management corporation than they do on the humanities, on the Jewish studies faculty, because it's a business. And the only way you will threaten that business is with money. So I will work in any capacity with the Trump administration over the next 4 years. I will work and continue to work with the House Education Committee, with members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans in the House and the Senate, to make sure that Harvard is held accountable for their past injustices, withhold their funds, tax their endowments, crack down on DEI, deport the foreign students who violated American law, which, by the way, has been American law for 50 years. That's not a particularly xenophobic or Islamophobic stance. That's simply enforcing American law. Do all of those things, and then you will see structural reforms. And again, why is it that Harvard settled yesterday? It's not a coincidence. It is direct response of Trump is in office, and they are scared to death, as they should be.
Good. In addition to the lawsuit, Shabbos, how do you rid these institutions of anti-Semitic faculty? Does the university have any oversight into what they're actually teaching, especially the liberal arts faculty?
Yes and no. So number one, we need to dispel this myth that tenure faculty are untouchable. It's just
Right.
simply not true. You can look at just at the last decade of institutions of higher learning who have rescinded the tenure position or simply disciplined their tenure faculty. It is possible. They have to follow internal school policy, and if they don't, and when they don't, there are consequences to it. So this myth that they are in a league of their own is just simply not true. In terms of the faculty broadly speaking, well, that's why our lawsuit is so important, because we want to go to the root of the issue. How are these faculty being hired? Why are they being promoted? Because it's not just faculty tucked away in some corner. Many of these individuals are department heads. So at Harvard, for example, you have department heads and you have high-level faculty who walked out during graduation, who interrupted commencement to call for, an intifada and say glory to the martyrs. You had hundreds of faculty, and we documented this, who were doing it. You have had for years Harvard faculty who indoctrinate their students. And again, this is not even conservative conjecture or exaggeration. I'll give you one quick example. Sure. There's a Harvard professor right now, and this is fully corroborated by a friend of mine, Nitzan Plitman. She just wrote an article about this in Haaretz. This professor gets up, this is years before October 7th, and she says in politics and media and academia, the Zionist narrative is the dominant narrative. So therefore, in this class, which by the way is called Religion and Peace, the Case of Israel-Palestine, in this class, she says, we will not read, we will not discuss, we will not study, we will not learn any texts if they were written by Israelis. This class was being taught for years. So why is it that when it comes to racism, when it comes to homophobia, when it comes to misogyny, Harvard really cracks down on what's being taught? When it comes to anti-Semitism, it's the only time where Harvard shows a laissez-faire approach of, professors can teach what they want. If that was their approach for everything, then fine. But it's not. It's a double standard.
Absolutely. We look forward to the proceedings. We will be glued to our TVs, I'm sure, watching you and your lawyers speak with the Harvard people. Thank you, Shabbos, for your tremendous advocacy. You and your team are performing. Look into your crystal ball. What are college campuses going to look like in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years? Feel free to talk about a specific college or maybe just the Ivy League.
Yeah, 1 year that'll be interesting. I don't know, but let's do farther in advance, 5, sure. 10 years from now. I do believe, I'm not saying this is what I think should happen, but I don't see enough young people in the Jewish community and enough parents in the Jewish community who are taking strong stances against the Ivy Leagues. Right. So I do think you'll see the number of Jews at Ivy League institutions either remain stagnant or, if anything, actually increase. I don't think you're going to see a drop. And you know what, I will just opine on this. I think that's a bad thing. Yes. I think Jewish parents and young Jewish people should use their leverage, should not go to institutions that are full of hate and anti-Semitism. At least until those institutions have changed. So use your power, use your leverage. Don't simply acquiesce to the system. I do think you're going to see a lot more conservative voices. In fact, there was an article this week in the New York Post, I believe, and college consulting organizations were saying that they are encouraging their applicants to talk about their conservative principles and their conservative ideologies a lot more abrasive and publicly than they would beforehand. And that is a direct response of the Trump mandate and this Trumpian culture whereby conservative voices are no longer willing to hide. Right. So you will see a lot more Republicans, you will see a lot more conservatives on campuses. And then the third thing is you will see, and this is probably more pertinent to the first year or the next year, you will see a crackdown on diversity, equity, and inclusion offices. You will see the rescinding of many of these DEI statements, for example, which are commonplace when it comes to tenure, when it comes to promotions. You have to sign these DEI statements. And I think that's also a pretty good thing. So those to me are the three immediate changes you will see. You'll probably see an increase in Jewish students at these institutions. You will certainly see an increase or a plethora of conservative voices, and you will see a crackdown on DEI and this groupthink culture. I think those will probably be the three most immediate impacts that the Trump campaign will have, simply by virtue of being in power.
Great. From your mouth to God's ears, Shabbos. I'll let you go, but before I go, I know you recently attended the inauguration. Give our listeners the top few highlights.
It was great. It was great. I think, to paraphrase Trump, we want to bring a revolution of common sense. Trump is a very pragmatic individual. This is someone who simply cares about winning. I don't think he's tied to one particular ideology. I think he's someone who simply just wants a utilitarian approach of what will be in the best interests of our country, what will be in the interests of our given communities. So inauguration to me was a breath of fresh air. I registered to vote as a Democrat the day I turned 18. I voted for Bernie. I was a volunteer for Jamal Bowman. I can out-progressive most of your listeners, but I was attracted to the Trump campaign because they were the only ones who were talking to Jewish students, the only ones who were saying that they would reform college campuses, that they would hold these institutions accountable. If Kamala Harris was willing to do those things, then I probably would have supported her, but she was useless, to put it mildly. So being at inauguration really affirmed all it is that I saw in President Trump, why it was I became, I don't know if surrogate is the right word, but I saw myself as trying to convince the American Jewish community in any way to support him. And just 2 nights ago at the ball, I won't name names, but I was mingling, of course, with many of the Trump admin officials, with many people on the campaign who've really been a source of strength for us Jewish students. And I can tell you as fact, it is not conjecture. It was not just promises made in terms of college campuses, but it will be promises kept. There is a real sense of commitment and dedication to holding these institutions accountable. And I do think you'll start seeing that through the legislative process pretty quickly in the coming weeks and months ahead.
That's great to hear, Shabbos. And lastly, you might want to tell our listeners, where do we sign up for the GoFundMe account that is now active to buy you a tuxedo?
Yes, please, because at the inaugural ball, I did not have a black tie attire. I posted after the fact to sort of excuse myself. I said, I'll buy a tux when we defeat Harvard. But that was really an excuse because I can't afford a tux. But you can message me on social media how you'd like to pay me. So Shabbos Kestenbaum on Twitter and Instagram. So
may we see you in shul in the future wearing a tuxedo, Shabbos.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Shabbos, for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it.